Välkomna till Svenska kyrkans monter, Se människan scen och seminariet Fredens janusansikte. Och här på scen så hälsar vi välkommen Ian Buruma från Holland, vår tidigare ärkebiskop KG Hammar. Och som ni nog kan läsa allihopa så hålls det här samtalet på engelska.
Yes, I also say welcome Ian Buruma. You are one of the global personalities on this book fair, so we are very proud to have you here in the Church of Sweden stage. We have met before when you published a book on taming the gods, on religion and politics and so on, so it's nice to see you again. And I have been involved a lot in peace issues since then, so this is very welcome, this book. Ian Buruma is professor of human rights and journalism and is writing in papers all over the world. First, I have a very personal question. Is there a small Mennonite in you?
My grandfather was a Mennonite, and my father, like a lot of children of men of the church, reacted by becoming an atheist. So I had no religious education. My mother came from a very assimilated Jewish family, and she knew almost nothing about the religion of her ancestors. So I grew up really with no religion at all, and which I regret in one respect, which is my relative ignorance. I would like to know more, even though that may not lead to faith, but I think one should know, at least. Is there a Mennonite? I think yes, because I think some of the Mennonite attitude stuck to my father, even though he no longer went to church. And the good side, I think, of being a Mennonite, and the Dutch Mennonites are rather different from the German ones, let alone the ones in America. In Holland, it was the most, for a long time, it's been the most ecumenical and liberal form of Protestantism. And so when gentlemen before the war in black suits and long beards would turn up at my grandfather's house from Germany, there was often a lot of miscommunication. But it has a tradition in the Netherlands of tolerance, of using reason, and so on, which is why a lot of typical Dutch liberals like Johan Huizinga, who wrote the book about the Middle Ages, he was a Mennonite, and there were others. So I'd like to think that some of the best aspects of the Mennonite faith rubbed off on me a little bit here and there.
Yeah, so yes, I think your grandfather would be very proud of your work for peace in the way you do it, by making us conscious of the importance of human rights all over, and also the futility of trying to solve our conflicts with war and violence and so on.
Yes, although my grandfather was a very eccentric clergyman, because the Mennonite, one of the things about the Mennonite faith is you're not allowed to bear arms. That doesn't mean you have to be a pacifist, but you're not allowed personally to use a weapon. But my grandfather adored his time in the army as an army clergyman. He didn't bear arms, but he loved it. He loved the uniforms and so on. And there's a story about World War II when he was in uniform as a clergyman in the first few days of May when Holland was at war with Germany, that he was there somewhere outside Rotterdam when German paratroopers approached. And he felt that one of the soldiers wasn't sort of taking good care enough. And he said to the soldier, as the clergyman, "There, shoot, left of the pole," which was not his proper role at all as a man of God. But he was not a pacifist.
The Mennonites, together with, for example, the Quakers, the Friends, are, the historical peace churches, we call them. So they are becoming more and more influential in global Christianity today. So in that sense, we learn from them. Your book is year zero, or noll, and it's about 1945. And you are trying to make us realize that this was not the glorious victory that we very unconsciously have taken for granted. And the picture on the cover is from Dresden. It's all ruins. And of course, that's very symbolic. Can you explain why you choose this?
Yes, I mean, the victory over Nazi Germany, of course, was glorious. It was a very good thing. But the reason I wrote this book was really to show that even wars that are entirely justified, that have to be fought, still result in all kinds of catastrophes that are maybe unavoidable. But war, just like occupation and dictatorship, create great wounds in society. They tear societies apart in ways that last long after the peace. So even though the victory was something sincerely to be celebrated, the aftermath was in many ways very cruel and violent, and people were hungry, and there was revenge, and there were civil wars, and so on and so forth. And the reason I make this point is that when thinking of this book, one of the things that made me want to write it was my feeling that during recent wars, like the one in Iraq, people who are promoting these wars were often of an age that had no personal memories of war. And they tended, the neoconservatives in the United States and so on, tended to talk about the use of military force, toppling Saddam Hussein and other dictators, as though once you've accomplished the military goal, everything's going to be okay. Then we'll have democracy and peace and everything is fine. Whereas we know from what we've seen in Iraq and other places, Libya, everything is not okay after a war. And military force is never, the use of military force, however necessary sometimes, is never without great cost and violent consequences. And I think the young generation today, people who are younger even than me, are often not sufficiently aware of it, don't even have the imagination, perhaps, to know that this is the case.
You spoke out against the Iraqi war from the beginning, and that was long before you started to think about this book.
Yes.
But it has been proven that you were so right, because all these refugee streams today, you could say that they started with the Iraqi war in a way.
Yes, I think that's true. I certainly didn't predict that. The reason I was against it from the beginning had less to do with seeing where it would lead than with the question of whether a government should ever go to war without being clear and honest about the reasons for going to that war with its own citizens. And I felt that the US government was not doing that. They were saying one thing today and something else tomorrow. The reasons were never made clear, and when they were made clear, they were usually lies. And so I thought the whole motivation for going to war in that case was already mistaken. It's tempting to think, as many people who think that they're very much in favor of human rights and freedom and democracy, it's tempting to think that using military force to achieve these aims by getting rid of dictators is always justified. But of course it isn't always justified. A war is really only justified if it's absolutely necessary to defend yourself, or if the use of force is certain to lead to something better than worse. And in the case of these wars, that was by no means clear.
And the results of after the Second World War, I mean, the book is about those effects on society and human beings and so on. And I'm sure that most people are not aware of the millions and millions of people who were killed after the war. I mean, those who suffered in concentration camps or in prisons, or fought against the Nazis in guerrilla-like warfare and so on, they were killed afterwards, after they have survived the war. And then they got stuck in this turmoil?
Well, the people who survived in the concentration camps were not so much killed as that they still died of the effects of having been in these concentration camps. And one of the problems was that the Allies, even their doctors, didn't have the experience to know how to feed starving people. So you got very well-willing British soldiers or American soldiers who went into concentration camps, found people who'd been starving, and then gave them army rations, which were sort of very fatty bits of meat and so on. If you're starving, your stomach can't take that, and you can very easily die as a result. So many people died, or of course, many people died of disease. Worse is you're right, there was of course an enormous amount of real violence too. And one of the problems, and again we see it in the Middle East so clearly, is that once you bring down a state, a regime, however nasty the regime, then the big question is who has the legitimacy, who has the right to rule the country afterwards? And in European countries, in the case of Italy, France, Greece, and so on, it was a very acute problem because the members of the resistance, led by communists very often, felt that they had the right to rule things, and whereas others felt that they didn't. And since both sides are still armed because of the war, that can lead to civil war or at least serious clashes. Then there is the Revolutionary War. A lot of the revenge against German people in Silesia and the Sudetenland, part of Czechoslovakia, where Germans had been living for many, many generations, when they were kicked out and were treated very brutally often by Poles and Czechs and others, this wasn't just spontaneous, popular hatred of Germans. It was deliberately stimulated, often by the communist parties, as a revolutionary act, because the Germans were the old bourgeoisie. They were the professors, the doctors, the lawyers, and so on. And so it wasn't just a matter of purging the Germans or getting rid of the German populations. It was also a part of the revolution that was taking place in Eastern Europe. So I think a lot of very little violence really is spontaneous. It does exist, obviously. People who have a personal problem with somebody else, and that can lead to vengeance and violence. But when violence is on a large scale, it's almost always politically manipulated.
And of course, the women paid a lot for these during these years and afterwards and so on. They become symbols of the submission to the enemy,
yes,
in many ways.
Yes, I mean, they're the easiest target. Defeat in war and occupation is a humiliating experience. And the symbol of that humiliation, of course, is that foreign soldiers occupy your country and then your own women are taken by them. And so many men after the war who felt humiliated, who were not heroic, suddenly became great heroes after 1945 by persecuting these women who had had German boyfriends for a variety of reasons, very rarely because they were Nazis, sometimes out of loneliness. But it was a very easy target to get rid of all that feeling of humiliation and frustration by picking on these women, instead of often on collaborators who've done much worse things than have a German boyfriend.
And many of these collaborators were back in power afterwards in many countries.
Yes, because, again, it has to do with legitimacy. And with the Cold War, all countries in the Western world wanted to make sure that communists would not take power. That meant you had to crush a lot of the wartime resistance against the Nazis, because the communists had played a large role in that. It also meant you needed the old conservative elites who'd often cooperated or collaborated with the Nazi occupation to come back. And that's why in Germany, after the Nuremberg trials, the Americans, when the Cold War began, but also the German non-Nazi German elites, like Konrad Adenauer, wanted to stop prosecution of war criminals and Nazis because they needed them in the war against communism. And you saw this in many different places.
Back to normality is one of your your big questions at the end of your book. I mean, now it's time to get back to normality. But that was also disappointing in a sense, that normality should really the world be the same as before the war started, as if it hadn't happened. For example, the colonial system remained, the subordination of women was expected to remain, anti-Semitism came back, and other things. Even your father went back to a mobbing system in the school after the war. And you have an idealistic hope that suffering would change us, improve us.
Well, in some ways it did. I think some people wanted to go back to the old society as it had existed before the war, whether it was colonial or domestic, because they'd been relatively privileged before the war. But, of course, after a catastrophe like World War II, things can never go back to the same thing. And there were many people who really did not want to go back to the old world. Certainly the colonized people didn't. So in a lot of some of the worst violence in East Asia, Southeast Asia, happened in what was then the Dutch East Indies, but now Indonesia. When the Dutch thought they could go back and rule Indonesia in the same way they had before the war, the Indonesians certainly had different ideas about this. They wanted to be free and independent, and that led to tremendous violence. And so, in some ways, that's an illustration of how war does change things very fundamentally, sometimes for the better. Women, for example, took on a public role in many countries during the war. They took jobs that men normally monopolized in industry and elsewhere because the men were not available. This is true in the United States as well as in Britain. Women worked in factories, had to take care of their families, and did not want to go back to the subservient housewife's role that they had before the war. And so in many countries, women got the vote for the first time after 1945. And it is true that in the 50s, there was a kind of conservative reaction in many countries when men tried to assert their authority again over women, but never completely. No. And so the feminism of the 1960s and women's liberation and so on really has its roots also in the wartime.
I think there is a small contradiction in your book when you say that we can never learn from history. I mean, you are supposed to say that, but at the same time, I think you write this book because you want us to learn something from it.
Well, we can learn to understand a great deal. Without history, you can't understand your own time and your own place in the world and so on. So it's essential to know about history. What I reject is the idea, which comes up in questions a lot. So what can we learn from 1945 to apply to the refugee crisis today? Well, there I wouldn't have a clear answer, because circumstances are always different. And it's easy to cherry pick from history. You take certain aspects of history and say, well, that's how it should be now. But that's never the whole story. There is no whole story. There are interpretations, there are certain aspects and so on which you highlight, which you interpret. So history is really a question of endless debate. And to think that just because, let's say, if only everybody knew the terrible consequences of the atom bombing of Hiroshima, we will never do such a thing again. That I fear is probably an illusion. That people, even if they know that things were terrible, they might very well do it again under different circumstances. And we have to guard against that. But I'm not sure that, in that sense, my book is going to improve the world as much as we might like it to do.
No, perhaps not, but improve the world, I think it does. And even though, if you take the ruins of Dresden, and you could put Dresden today beside it, and then you see, yes, we can rise from ruins. We have done it, and we will continue to do so. Your book. The conclusion of the book is you bring your father back to Berlin, where he was in forced labor during the war, and the Berlin Wall has just fallen. And you lose him there. It's New Year's Eve, but he comes back safely. He's still alive, I heard. So, there is to me, that is a sign of hope. I mean,
yes.
you have built up a story about hope.
Well, you could see the history of mankind as endlessly building castles in the sand, and then it gets destroyed, and then we build them up again, and then it gets destroyed, and we build them up again. So the human capacity for construction may be as strong as the capacity for destruction, but we can never get rid of destruction. So the story about my father at the Berlin Wall, you give it a more positive spin than it actually has in the book. Because what happened is my father is not somebody who had tremendous war traumas, not as far as I know. But one thing about living through the Battle of Berlin with the Soviets coming in and the Stalin organs and the bombings day and night and so on, one thing he has, which he hates loud bangs. He does not like fireworks, because it reminds him of 1945. So there we were at the Berlin Wall, celebrating in 1989, December 1989, celebrating the fall of the wall. Everybody thought, now the world is going to be better, and so on. Finally, the whole of Europe is free. And we lost our father in the crowd when everybody was popping bottles of Sekt and fireworks were going off at midnight, and we'd lost our father, couldn't find him. And a few hours later, when we got back to the hotel, he came in with a great bandage over his face because somebody had let off a fire rocket and it landed right in the middle of between his eyes. And it's a slightly bitter story, but it was my way of telling that after the illusion of now everything will be great, disillusion very quickly follows.
But then it was New Year.
True.
So, as you say, the importance is how we interpret history.
Yes.
And it's my job, at least, to see the hope
in
your
hope
writing.
Where others despair.
Thank you so much, Ian Buruma, for
Thank
this.
You.
Thank you.
Tack så mycket, får vi säga.